certainly piqued my interest. Now we're recording, excellent. Tom is a colleague here at UBC in the Department of Theater and Film. He is also the faculty lead on conflict theater at UBC and vice president of the American Society for Cybernetics. I think that means that Dan Brown is going to write the book that is the basis of his biopic, but we'll probably find out a bit more about cybernetics along the way too. In addition to his continuous practice as an internationally recognized actor, director, writer, and producer, his research investigates the use of modes of interactive theater as tools for modeling and diagnosing complex social problems. He's published this work in various peer-reviewed journals and is about to defend his PhD dissertation. Congratulations, Thomas, fantastic. And it's going to be on systems theater. Also relevant, I think, to what we'll hear today. And he's writing this at the Center for System Studies in the Faculty of Politics, Business, and Law at the University of Hull. Tom, tell us more, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. What does this say? The host of Spotlight Video, would you like to unmute? Yes. There we go. Thank you so much for that fabulous introduction. So yeah, and how did a guy with an IMDb page end up over here on this side of the street is a story in and of itself that we won't necessarily have time to go into today, but hopefully what I present today will you'll feel is worthwhile, and that I've got something to bring to this area, and just know that to me, you know, you're all rock stars to me working in this area, because this is obviously a space that I'm keen to work in, and bringing some arts-based inquiry into this realm as well. But this all started really, well, my research in systems and cybernetics and how theater can be used as a mode to model complex social systems eventually led me through various connections to Tamara Baldwin, who initially came to me just because I was the curriculum chair for the Faculty of Arts at the time, and she said, "Well, we're trying to get this course on wicked problems up," and I just lit up. I said, "Someone's going to do a course on wicked problems," because in the circles that I move in systems and cybernetics, the term wicked problems is on our lips constantly, and so I managed to insert myself into the process, and here we are. So we aren't going to use any theater-based methods today, but please know that when in the course that we developed and the time that I was able to be an instructor, we've had a number of different excellent instructors, but we do use some theater-based methods from the Theater of the Oppressed and from some other sources as well. But I'm going to talk more generally about wicked problems, but particularly around disagreement. And so first I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from my office here at UBC on the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm continually grateful for their forbearance and tolerance of my presence on this land as an uninvited guest. So I'm going to start us off in a lighter vein, because some of you of my vintage, or perhaps even been around even longer, might recognize the phrase of my title. And for those of you who don't, I'm hoping this might be a kind of a fun way into. So I'm just going to show you a very brief video. So let me, oh boy. No, is that what I want? Share. No, you don't want to look at that screen. Oh my goodness. Sorry, here we go. This is what we want. Boom. And then screen share. 18 months into the pandemic, I'm still figuring out how to do all this. All right, so I'd like to have an argument, please. And I'm gonna start with a playful way in. So we're just gonna watch a fun little video. But that we'll just leave it there for now. Let me see if this will work and I get into presenter mode here. Okay, so so hopefully that was a fun way to sort of begin the day. Monty Python's Flying Circus, of course. But to me, it also, the futility of that exercise, obviously, the idea of this constantly cycling of negation is painful, obviously, even if you're not paying for it, even if you're getting paid to be in the room where it's happening. But the idea of just this constant attempt to negate each other's point of view is obviously not helpful. And so a part of what we're gonna look at today is a way to have an argument that hopefully is more productive than that, and often the technique is chosen to be used at a point where in a deliberative process you notice that you're starting to cycle in that way, that we're sort of stuck in someone makes a statement on this point, someone negates it, well, yeah, but this, yeah, but that, and you're starting to cycle. And particularly if one sees that there's some value in both sides, and that one of the reasons we're cycling is that both of the elements, both of the positions that are being argued are of some value, and we're going to have to make a tough choice. So this is particularly relevant, again, to this world of wicked problems. So I'm sure many of you, maybe most or all of you, are familiar with this term coined by Riddle and Weber in '73 in a paper called Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, to describe problems with these sorts of features, where things are so complex and interconnected that there isn't even a clear problem definition. They're multi-causal, multi-scalar. There's multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas, crossing organizational disciplinary boundaries. Each one is connected to another one. If you tweak the system in one place, it ramifies throughout the systems. You can't find a right or wrong, but better or worse. That's going to be really important. And they're never solved. A wicked problem, according to Riddle and Weber, can never be solved. So they introduced this term wicked. They believe that a wicked problem could only be tamed, that it will not disappear, but it could be managed in such a way that it's not creating what ultimately, in the worst case, are these wild oscillations between approaches that then just create these massive waves of unintended consequences. And so we have to find a way to manage these problems, to tame them in an effective way. So the first thing I'd like to look through this lens is, this is coming from critical systems heuristics, which was developed by a gentleman named Werner Ulrich, and we'll be looking more at these towards the end. But this is what he calls his eternal triangle that he wants to bring to every analysis of a problem situation. For me, this has been critical, and we've used it a lot in the Wicked Problems course. That we start with a boundary judgment. When we're talking about a situation, the problem, there's a boundary around that problem. And from a systems point of view, of course, this idea of interconnection keeps going and going and going. But at some point, we put a boundary around what we call the problem situation. And certain things are inside that boundary, and other things are outside of that boundary. Very often, we don't make that boundary judgment explicit, even to ourselves. We think there's a common understanding amongst all the stakeholders. When I'm talking about the problem, I'm talking about X. The other really important thing that Ulrich's trying to bring our attention to is that these boundary judgments are not neutral. They are conditioned by our values and our facts, and the three things condition each other. So where we choose to put the boundary determines what counts as a fact, what observations are relevant and not relevant. And those are ultimately driven by our values, which remain mostly buried, right? There isn't one boundary for the system that is obvious. And in this type of, in critical systems thinking, we don't even talk about systems as if they're the real thing. A system, in a sense, is a way of connecting some things and talking about them. The boundary is arbitrary. The boundary is placed by us when we define the problem space, and there are values implicit in where we judge them, in where we place them. So, and that's going to determine facts. So for instance, one of the examples that when we practice these skills in various classes and workshops I've been involved in with conflict theater, and I work closely with the Office of Equity and Inclusion. One of the hot debates on campus right now is, should everyone return to work, or should people still be allowed to work at home? If the system we're talking, if the boundary is around the campus, then the arguments are going to be of a certain type. But only if there's if the boundary is in a certain place, will the fact that, say, for instance, there is the benefits to the environment, right? So if we're talking about whether or not we should decide whether or not people should come back to work, if our system includes nature as a whole and not just the university campus, then observations, facts about the environmental impact of people coming to campus can be included in the discussion. But if we place the boundary tighter around the campus or around one's workplace, or even extending to people's ability to pick up their children or whatever, certain things are included and certain things are excluded. So boundary judgments, where we place the boundary around the problem, is incredibly important. There is no right boundary and there is no wrong boundary. We need to pick a boundary in order to be able to be effective, but we need to be transparent with ourselves and the other stakeholders about the values. So environmentalism as a value makes me put the boundary out, including the natural environment and not just the work processes. The values determine facts, determine boundaries, and vice versa. You cannot move one without the other two being implicated. And transparency, first for ourselves and for the others we're in discussion with, is key, particularly in a wicked problem situation. It's not right or wrong. There's not a right boundary, there's not a wrong boundary, but there is a boundary and it's a judgment, not an automatic fact of nature, so to speak. Okay. So I'm going to introduce something that comes from this tradition called deep democracy. Sorry, I'm just going to close something here so I can read. So developed by a gentleman named Arnold Mindell. So deep, what's deep about deep democracy? It's an attitude that focuses on the awareness of voices that are central and marginal. One of the things, principles of deep democracy is if you're in some kind of consultation process that seems to be moving towards some kind of consensus, but you still feel that there are some dissenting voices out there, it's our jobs, according to the principles of deep democracy, to find that resistance and amplify it, to not be too easily seduced by a sense of we're getting close to consensus, there's just a few holdouts. They call that searching for the no. And often the resistance might not have even been expressed yet because people in various reasons, power hierarchies, et cetera, are feeling uncertain about expressing that. So if it feels too good to be true that we're moving to consensus, seek out the no. Is there anyone who feels different from this? And if only one person speaks up, is there anyone else who shares any of these concerns? Seek out the no and amplify it, because chances are there's some wisdom there about the system that's trying to surface and that needs to surface. So deep democracy begins with seeking out the no, actively seeking the resistance and trying to amplify it until you can determine a polarity that you can then use this argument technique. And I'm also going to introduce this idea of polarity management. So this principle, unlike classical democracy, which focuses on majority rule, deep democracy suggests that all voices, states of awareness, and frameworks of reality are important. Deep democracy also suggests that the information carried within these voices, awareness, and frameworks are all needed to understand the complete process of the system. So we amplify the no, and then often what will happen then is we'll find ourselves cycling and getting into an argument that starts to appear too similar to the one we just saw in the Python sketch, and we maybe need to move into using this tool of deep democracy. Now, while these two tools were not developed together, if we're going to have a deep democracy argument, there's three agreements, and I'm going to get to the actual argument later, but three things that must be present if we're going to use this method amongst the stakeholders or who's in the room consulting. We agree that we want or need to remain in relationship with each other. That makes a huge difference to the kind of discourse you're going to have. If this is about, I don't care if I ever see you again, versus we need to maintain relationship, that's an important element in terms of guiding the type of discourse that's possible. We must agree that no one has a monopoly on truth, and we must all agree that we're interested in this as an opportunity to learn and grow, not simply as an opportunity to win or to get it your way. We're still going to have our allegiances. We're still going to have our ideas that we feel strongly about. But if we can agree that these three things are true for us, then it's possible to have a deep democracy argument. But I'll flip for a moment over to polarity management, because these two go hand in hand. And I need to thank my colleagues like Ashley Moore at the Office of Equity and Inclusion for working with me and helping me understand the connections between these two. Polarities are interdependent pairs of values or points of view. They need each other over time to gain and maintain performance. So the classic polarities we find, here's one that you folks will be, of course, all too painfully familiar with, is decentralization, centralization, right? And organizations that go through a period where they go, everything's too loose, everything's too lax, we need to centralize. And then we centralize, and then, oh, no, this isn't working, we need to decentralize, everything's too top down. And these cycles of centralize and decentralize, which are indicative of some wickedness inside the organization that keeps moving between these two poles. Both sides' values exist, and they are not more important than the other. And polarities are about managing the relationship between the two. The difference between problem solving and polarity thinking is problem solving is about either or thinking, and polarity thinking is about both and thinking. So here's where, even though Barry Johnson, who created polarity management, doesn't talk about wicked problems, not that anywhere I've come across, this language is very, very compatible with it. Polarity management involves identifying when a problem is unsolvable. Instead of tackling the question, how can we try to solve this problem? Management focuses on the question, is this a problem which can be solved? And you're going to see as we look at polarities that we identify one thing as the problem and the other pole is the solution, and then we just back and forth between them. So some common polarities. Should things be standardized or should we be flexible? Should we have an individual focus or a team focus? Should things be centralized, etc.? And so I do this exercise with lots of different groups. And as I said recently, we've been doing it a lot around the return to work or stay at home. So a classic example of a polarity. So I'm going to take something that's really, really simple. Oops. Oh, is this not going to allow me to? Oh, no, it's not going to. All right. Well, so I've got two polarities, which is inhaling and exhaling. So I didn't realize that when I click on this in the context of a slide, it won't let me write on it. So I'm just going to talk my way through this. So you make a polarity map, 4 quadrants, and you put the two polarities on either side, and you have a positive up high and you have a minus down below. And you are able to put the varying characteristics in these components. So what's good about inhaling? Well, obviously, it gives us oxygen, and we need oxygen to breathe. So in some crazy imaginary world, we decide our policy is we're going to inhale. That's what we're going to do. We're all about inhaling. We're an inhaling organization. Well, then the negative side of inhaling, if you stick to that as a concrete, unbending policy, is that eventually you've got CO2 building up. Oh, our problem is that we've got too much CO2. The solution is we need to become an exhaling organization. So we go from here, we drop down to here, and then we go up to the positive side. So in mapping it, you're just listing the positive and negative. So let's say we've got, we get oxygen, which is great. The negative is we start to build up CO2. Up here, we expel CO2, and down here we need oxygen. But if we define this as the problem, the bottom one is the problem, and this one as the solution, and vice versa, we set ourselves up for this oscillation, and we end up doing this. And the fact that it's a symbol for eternity, I think, is a great metaphor. We go over here, and then we get diminishing returns, and then we go, that's the problem, this is the solution. Oh, now this is the problem, now that's the solution. And we get caught up in these oscillating, when of course, somehow the organization, us, needs to become both an inhaling and an exhaling organization that breathes and that has mechanisms inside of it that know when to inhale and when to exhale, right? Our body knows how to do these things. So our body manages the polarity of the need for inhaling and exhaling. Great. So this is some example of some of the things that we've gotten with some groups we worked on, where we just played with the question of, is it okay to give someone, should it be okay to give someone a compliment at work or not? You know, that's a nice dress, you know, nice glass, or I like your new hairdo. Not an uncontroversial topic. So these are just some of the things that came from the different groups, right? So side A was, it's okay to give compliments, compliments build relationships, breaks the ice, team building. Negative side, it can make people uncomfortable, can reinforce prejudices, unequal playing field. So then the positive side of having a no compliments policy, no one feels singled out, don't have to be self-conscious, protection from harassment, but we might lose interaction in the building of trust, discomfort of censorship builds up resentments, lack of spontaneity. On one of the other groups, they said it dehumanizes the environment. So we see this polarity. I think we had 3 groups that did this, yeah. So once we've mapped a polarity, though, and we recognize that our tendencies are to keep going in this circle, in this infinity symbol, can we find ways to, well, we could pick one and say, no, we're just going to try and stay here, which means we need to develop some kind of feedback mechanism, some kind of early warning system for when we're dipping down into here. So that becomes then the design challenge for the organization or for the system is we want to stay up here. How do we keep it from dripping down here? What are the feedback mechanisms? This is where the cybernetics comes in. What are the feedback mechanisms that are going to awaken the governance structures that keep us here? Ideally, we might be able to create a place where we circle inside here most of the time, and that whenever we start to dip, we catch it early enough and we create a balance between these. But we've gotten out of the thinking that one is the problem and the other is the solution. And we're going to try and work to find ways to find a polarity balance. And I'll get to the argument in a minute, how this changes. It's very simple, obviously, but it also changes the nature of dialogue that people have when we start to work on it this way, rather than get into an argument in the traditional way and present our positions for both. So this is going to connect to the technique of the argument. So this is how the argument works in deep democracy. And if we have enough time, we might spend some time, because I'm going pretty quick here. We might have some time to play with having an argument. So it's a very, very structured sort of process. Everyone will face in the room, will sit and face in one direction. And what we will do as a group is we will commit to one side of the polarity, even though we know that some people are already on opposite sides already. They have a preference for what they're going to argue for. But we're going to do this in this way. And no one has to speak, right? If you don't have anything to say on behalf of the other polarity, you don't say anything. But everyone faces in one direction, and the actual embodied action of turning and all facing one direction has a profound impact on the people in the room. And we take our time to make every argument we can think of on behalf of that one polarity. And we resist that devilish temptation to immediately jump to the other side and try and refute, try and negate. We're just going to empty the quiver of every single arrow we can think of. So we take our time. We just keep all on one side. And when we get itchy and think, oh, but I want to give a counter argument, we just relax, because we know the situation is built, the structure is built, that we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So let's all be patient together in this room. Let's together fire every arrow that we can think of in that direction until we think it might be exhausted. But we've also got the guarantee that we're going to come back again if someone feels that they've got a new argument, or that there's something else that's come up for them. The facilitator tries to amplify and reflect back what's being said. So if they hear what the person said, and they might then turn the dial up a little bit on the rhetoric in case the person feels their fear of being ostracized, the person has an opportunity to say, no, I didn't mean it in that stark a term or whatever. But the facilitator can play with amplifying it a little bit, at least reflecting back. We do that until all of the arrows in the quiver have been exhausted going in that direction. And then we turn our chairs and we face in the opposite direction. And we do the same process until we get the arrows all from this one quiver are out there. And then once we've done that, we say, did anything come up back from our first polarity that someone needs to add? We can switch back there, see if there's anything else that needs to be said. Vice versa, we can do that a few times until we really feel like we've emptied the arrows on both sides. And then we move into a phase where we harvest insights. In the middle of this exercise, did anyone have any new insights about the issue that we're talking about? And the results, and again, if we have time, we might be able to try this a little bit. The type of dialogue that takes place is markedly different than in a typical kind of discussion. People's insights start to drop in deeper. Often we start to see people who are very firmly on one side start raising some things from the other side, because the longer they think about it and the more they listen, they start to understand the value in the other position. So there's a deepening, and there's a different kind of listening that goes on. And there's a kind of, again, learning and growing that people have agreed to. And then we harvest those insights. And if a consensus is beginning to form out of the insights, now that we've had an argument in this style, but there are still some dissenting voices, then the next question we ask the dissenting voices is, what would you need to come along with the majority consensus that's starting to form? And it might be, well, there's a little bit of the other polarity we need to make sure we keep, or so there's some room for negotiation in there. At the end of the day, of course, action is going to need to be taken. Some kind of policy decision is going to have to be made, and not everyone's going to be happy about it by definition, particularly in a wicked problem, because we're not even pretending to have the solution. We're looking for a way to tame the wicked problem or to manage a polarity or a number of polarities. But this opens up room for some further type of dialogue, and the space that's been cleared by allowing both polarities to be aired in such a deep way tends to create a different sort of tone in the room and a different space for those dissenting voices and the majority voices to continue to see if there are some of these come along accommodations that can be met. So of course, at the end of all this, so how this relates to polarities is that you can do both at once. You can have the argument, and at the same time, everyone can have a polarity map and be jotting down insights of the positive and negatives from that are raised from the argument. So they're voiced in slightly different ways, right? So the negative might be implicit as the opposite of the positive that someone's speaking, for instance, but people can sort through that. So you can walk out of this both with having had the verbal communication of the argument and the embodied experience of being on one side together and then being on the other side together. But you can also come out with this artifact, this polarity map that can be helpful in moving forward towards a policy. So the rubber, though, of course, does have to hit the road eventually. We do need to make some kind of decisions. And so this is where I come back to critical systems heuristics. It's a framework for reflective practice based on practical philosophy and systems thinking. Three main concerns: to be critical, reflective competence, not only of well-trained professionals and decision makers, but also of ordinary people. This is critical to critical systems, essential to critical systems heuristics, is that it's also designed to level the playing field. As I love that this came up in the description of ORIS too, and I forgot it was in that official description about questioning the notion of expertise. We're not saying that the expertise doesn't exist, but often people are shut down in their disagreement or their dissent because they're told they're not experts and that other people hold the expertise and they're not qualified. Critical systems heuristics opens up ways that the so-called experts, perhaps actual experts, and the ordinary people end up on the same playing field in terms of the transparency around the boundary judgments and the definitions of expertise and the metrics of improvement. Everyone is subjected to the same playing field. So a reflective practice cannot be secured by theoretical means only, but requires heuristic support in the form of questions and argumentation tools that make a difference in practice. And systems thinking can provide us with a useful starting point for understanding the methodological requirements of such an approach to reflective practice. Once again, I return back to the notion of boundary critique, the boundary choice. The basic idea of CSH is to support boundary critique, a systematic effort of handling boundary judgments critically. Boundary critique may take two main forms. It can aim at handling boundary judgments self-critically, so to become more reflective about our own practice in terms of where we end up putting boundaries when we're in a problem solving or searching for some way to wrestle and tame a wicked problem. Or it can use boundary judgments for critical purposes against those who may not handle them so self-critically. So it can be an emancipatory practice also for those who are going to be affected by someone else's decision-making. And they want to be able to have a dialogue that at the very least can bring out some transparency so that no one is allowed to simply say, this is the right choice. They must say, this is the choice that we made, starting by placing the boundary here for these reasons. And so it doesn't become a question of right or wrong. It becomes about a transparent approach that people can understand and can continue to push back on, but the kind of transparency and clarity it brings, like at first in that reflexive way, actually applied to one's own thinking, and then also in the emancipatory way. And it consists of this set of questions. Why is this not? Oh, right. I'm gonna switch over to. I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment, and I'm gonna switch over to share a document rather than a slideshow. So, sorry, one moment. Here we go. All right. This is from the paper that I would recommend for everyone, and I guess I put it in the chat at the end, which is by Rourke, A Brief Introduction to Critical Systems Heuristics. So these are the categories of questions that any proposal for policy or for a program designed to create improvement need to be asked. And they can be asked in the is, and should be asked in the is or the and the ought mode. So one is, how is what we're doing structured at the moment? And the ought is, where would we actually like to move this? So who is or ought to be the client or beneficiary? That is, whose interests should be served. So when I'm thinking about the, come back to work or not come back to work, so should professors, are we trying to serve the work-life balance of staff? Are we trying to serve the best delivery methods for students? So depending on which one we're serving and where the value that then is going to place the boundary somewhere, are we relying on professors to tell us the best use of their time? Or are we looking at studies, peer-reviewed studies on the effectiveness of online learning versus in-person learning? So it's going to affect, right? So who's the beneficiary? And that, of course, is going to, as I just mentioned, impact these other things. What is or ought to be the purpose? That is, what or ought to be, should be the consequences. Are we trying to create more work-life balance for everybody, or are we trying to create a maximum academic impact? Again, those can become another polarity that then we can try and balance. But at the end of the day, we have to make a proposal. What is or ought to be the measure of improvement or measure of success? How can we determine that the consequences taken together constitute an improvement? So those are the sources of motivation. Then the sources of power. Who is or ought to be the decision maker? That is, who should be in a position to change the measure of improvement? What resources and other conditions of success are or ought to be controlled by the decision maker? That is, what conditions of success can or should those involve control? And what conditions of success are or ought to be part of the decision environment? That is, what conditions can or should the decision maker not control, e.g. from the viewpoint of those not involved. And then sources of knowledge. Who is or ought to be considered a professional or further expert? That is, who is or should be involved as a competent provider or of experience and expertise. So really interesting situations are happening on our campus, of course, in terms of, particularly in a department like mine, where people are asked to read plays and watch films. Sometimes the content, if it depicts acts of extreme racism, sexual violence, things like that, students are saying, I should not have to watch this. I should not have to watch this. And some professors will say, well, I'm trying to teach you something about film or about theater, and I think that this is important that you learn to see this in another way beyond that it triggers your own personal trauma. And often in those arguments, the professor will say, I'm the expert. I'm the expert on whatever. I'm the expert on literature. And so I think it's important that you read Heart of Darkness, because I'm the expert on literature. But is the professor, for instance, an expert on trauma? Are they, and can they ever be the expert on the impact that something has on an individual? Certainly my own, just speaking for myself, my own approach to my teaching of acting is, I consider myself to be an expert on an approach to being an actor. I'm not an expert on how any of the things I ask my students to do might impact them based on their own personal histories. They are the experts on that. There's a polarity. There's something we need to manage between my expectations and their expertise on how things impact them. Again, that's a whole huge topic we could spend hours mapping and working on. But this notion of expertise is really, really crucial. Who is considered an expert and why? What kind of expertise ought to be consulted? What counts or should count as relevant knowledge? So, yeah, as I'm preparing my acting syllabus, am I turning to trauma-informed literature, or am I only using standard acting literature? What is relevant knowledge? Again, where do I put the boundary? If my boundary is simply around, I want them to be employable professional actors, I may not look at something about trauma-informed practice. But if my boundary also includes the value without harm to the students, suddenly a whole new body of literature might count as relevant knowledge in the situation that I'm looking at. What or who ought to be assumed to be the guarantor of success? That is, should those involved seek some guarantee that improvement will be achieved? For example, consensus among experts, the involvement of stakeholders, the experience and intuition of those involved, political support. Who's going to, who's the guarantor of success, and where do we seek that guarantee? How are we going to know when we're there? To me, this also goes back to, if we're going to try and map a space where we can stay in the upper two quadrants of a polarity, how are we going to know when we're starting to dip? What is our distant early warning system for dipping down into the lower parts of the quadrant that are going to kick in the regulating mechanisms that we've built in to try and get us back to the upper parts of the quadrant? And then finally, the sources of legitimation. Who is or ought to be witness to the interests of those affected but not involved? That is, who is or should be treated as a legitimate stakeholder? And who argues or should argue the case of those stakeholders who cannot speak for themselves, including future generations and non-human nature? So this goes back to my example of the, everyone come back to campus or everyone stay at home. If we don't ask this question, what is the impact on non-human nature? We've got a completely different boundary and a completely different discussion going on. Now, one could say the answer to that question is nobody, right? This is not a prescription. These questions are not a prescription. You could turn around and say, well, nobody. That's just not part of the system we're looking at. But you're going to have to say that, and you're going to have to be transparent about that with ourselves and with the other stakeholders. That's just not included. Instead of having these debates and arguments where, while we're each bringing out our argument on behalf of our position, the boundary's fluctuating all over the place because someone will introduce this argument or that argument, and the boundary is just, it's all over the map. So securing these boundary conditions, which we can always change and move, but keeping them clear. What secures or ought to secure the emancipation of those affected from the premises and promises of those involved? Where does legitimacy lie? What worldview ought to be determining? That is, what different visions of improvement are or should be considered, and how should they be reconciled? This is really key. Again, sometimes what it asks for is, I think, the courage to just be clear about the worldview that one is going to use, and being clear about that, not stating that it's the only worldview or the only set of criteria we could look at, but being clear about it, that there isn't one worldview that is true, or it is a position we're taking. So in the class with in the Wicked Problems class that I developed with Tam and Maura Quayle and others, because we're dealing in the realm of community development in the context of India, there are many different worldviews, right? There are local worldviews. There's the scientific, rational worldview. There's so-called Western medicine and traditional medicine. There's a lot of different worldviews in the picture, and which one is going to lead, or how are we going to manage the polarities between those worldviews, need to be surfaced and need to be considered. So these are the set of questions that Ulrich wants us to ask of ourselves, and become the tool through which also people who are not considered experts, who don't have all of the research at their hands, they have these questions at least to ask of those who are making decisions that they're going to be affected by. And at the very least, as I keep saying over and over, I know at the very least, create transparency and clarity around where is the boundary, what values are leading, and what what is considered a fact and an observation that is relevant to the decision space and what is not, as opposed to assuming that it's obvious what those things are. Because again, I started by talking about Russell Ackoff, the notion that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So to me, it's about answering those critical systems heuristics questions in a way that we can live with, not in a way that is perfect, not that in a way that is going to take care of every single question. But, and when I say we, you know, who is the we, first of all, right? It's implicit in those questions too. How are the stakeholders' voices included? And where's legitimacy going to lie? So those questions, if we discipline ourselves to try and answer those questions, hopefully we can build deliberative processes that are more inclusive, because they don't allow a certain group to simply say we are the experts and you are not. All of those, the epistemologies at work need to be foregrounded and put on the table. So those are the three different sorts of tools that I wanted to try and bring together. The argument coming from deep democracy, the notion of polarity management that really comes from organizational development, but I hope is relevant in this as well. To use those as to have different types of, take different situations of disagreement and try and make them more generative rather than divisive. And then at the end of the day, though, when one has to make a move in some direction or other, the critical systems heuristics can hopefully take us across the goal line, so to speak, in a way where we still remain responsive to the concerns and questions by people who may have very different feelings about it, but we're not claiming too much. That's one of my favorite things that Ulrich says about the critical systems heuristics, is they can be used to ask an expert, don't you claim too much? Aren't you claiming just a little too much? And to try and make those assumptions and assertions really right-sized. So I've come in a little under time because I wanted to make sure we got to all of these, which leaves us ample time for questions or even to try a little bit of an argument if we wanted, but I will turn it back to our moderator, Julian, and just say thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Fantastic. In acting my caricature of my impressions of show business, I would say, ladies and gentlemen, Tom Scholte, and then we get roaring applause. Terrific, Tom, thank you very much. Really interesting, sort of taking notes along the way. Let me encourage everyone to think up their questions. Use the raise hand feature. I could call on you, but you may also paste them into the chat as some people may be starting to do. Let me start off with a question, Tom. The creative power of disagreement, and even more so the term wicked problems, to me, in an academic context, in a, you know, the kind of problems that we think about in the School of Public Policy Global Affairs, our solution is almost always collaboration, or our imagined solution. Now, collaboration is a word you did not say. Some of that is terminology, and it's, you know, different sort of epistemic communities that use different terms or so. But just to go with that a little bit more, many of the sources you draw on have sort of spatial metaphors or spatial views of thinking about things, right? You've got sort of two sides, actually turning your chair. The boundaries are conceived of as a geography, like as a spatial connection. And in my mind, collaboration is yeah, there's a coming together implied, but it doesn't really have I don't think has a very much of a spatial dimension. So are these just different ways of approaching problems? Is collaboration an alternative to this kind of disagreement structured by some of the things you've talked to, or is it just different terminology?
I think in some ways it's different terminology. It's interesting, yeah, though I didn't use that word at all. I'm hoping that collaboration is implied in that even the invitation to have an argument of this nature is saying we want to include these voices, as opposed to, well, we're already at a majority here. We've got 60 to 20, we're good to go, right? There's this idea that deep democracy says it's not enough to take the vote and then move on from there. It's important to go, what's going on with those 20 people who don't want to come along? And what wisdom do they have that needs to be surfaced, that needs to be part of our of our decision space. So I think that's inherently collaborative, and that polarity management hopefully takes us in the same direction. I guess what I'm looking at is situations where I'm thinking of situations where collaboration obviously needs to happen as much as possible. But at a certain point, there are people that are in the position of decision maker. There are people that are going to have to make the call, and to get comfortable with the fact that, and for old professionals like you, and not old, experienced professionals like yourself, being comfortable with the fact that not everyone agrees maybe is old news. Maybe, that's just, but to get comfortable with the fact that even I'm not going to defend my choice as the perfect choice. I'm going to defend my choice as the best choice from this perspective, from this epistemological viewpoint, from this. So I guess I deeply value collaboration and hope that it's implicit in all of these modes. I would say, though, I guess I'm thinking a lot about from the perspective of the person who at the end of the day has to make the decision. I don't know if that helps with your question.
So that the versions where we reach for collaboration as a way to overcome the wickedness of some of those wicked problems still maybe suffer to some extent from the idea that that decision at the end, maybe not perfect, but is best. And what you've described has a greater variety of decisions, or more voices, or louder voices. Is that some of the difference then?
Yeah, absolutely. It's wanting to make sure that those voices, the dissenting voices, still show up somehow in the decision that's made. I mean, I'm wading into territory that's beyond me at the moment compared to this group. But I think of minority governments in a sense, in the really simplest way, that the opposition's voice must be present somehow, or the government doesn't last. So in a situation where you've got the majority, you could just do what, I've got the mandate on the classical democracy level. Deep democracy is saying, no, that's not enough. The wisdom of the dissenters is an important part of the system that you're engaged in, and has to be reflected somehow in the decision you make.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, not surprisingly, we've got stuff happening in the chat, and you're probably following too. And I'll go sort of roughly in order for the moment. But and I want identify people by name so they don't have to be for the recording and all that. Let me start with the first one I see. What do you do with the science deniers?
Well,
do they get to shoot quivers out of their air, or do they get to empty their quiver?
Sure, absolutely, they do. They do. They do. And at the end of the day, we're not going to please everybody. Of course, this is not going to convince the science deniers that science is real, as They Might Be Giants aptly said in a great album for kids.
Oh, what a reference, Tom! You're my hero. Yes, They Might Be Giants. They have all the answers.
Yeah, they've got a song called "Science is Real."
They do.
But the transparency of saying, you don't have to say you're an idiot to the person who's a science denier. You don't have to say you're not an idiot, but you can simply say, but for the purposes of this decision, this is where we're looking. This is how we've defined expertise in this moment. I recognize you may disagree with that, but these are the metrics we're using. The science denier will continue, but so there's not a solution to the science denier, but it's simply a statement of, this is the worldview we're going with. I'm not going to dump all over your worldview. I'm just going to tell you that this is the one we're using at this moment. I don't know if that softens it or, yeah.
It begins to speak to the next question I see there as well, I think, about how do we build the conditions for this, right? How do we build that commitment to being in and maintaining a relationship in order to engage in some of these processes? Science deniers is one version, but that's sort of an extreme version, right? But many of these disagreements do probably require or see some kind of an engagement willingness to as a prerequisite, right?
Yeah, I think that's another place where systems thinking can really play a role. That if people, on opposite sides who think there's a solution where they can just go their separate ways, and maybe there are, and there are times where we can't, because this mode of working doesn't come with very many a priori sort of truths, right? The idea that maybe we can't stay in a relationship, that's on the table. You know what I mean? If it's actually, no, we can't stay in a relationship, what we need to do is to find a way to separate. That's not off the table. But I think that using systems thinking to help people grasp the level of interdependencies that they might not be able to grasp might create more of a sense of why it's worth exploring remaining in relationship to just breaking apart. But deciding, actually, no, I don't want to be in a relationship with this person, or I don't need to, particularly, in work situations or whatever. I think it's a question that needs to be asked, because opting on the side of separation isn't off the table either. But we may discover that staying in a relationship is actually necessary to our mutual survival, i.e. on the planet. So we need to stay in relationship with each other. So we better start getting good at it, or better at it at least.
Now that you've planted the seed of minority government as a comparison in our mind, that one of my colleagues in the chat has also picked up on, do we need to stay in that relationship or not, is maybe what some of the parties are asking themselves.
Yeah, that's political calculus, right? I don't need to stay in a relationship now because I'm ahead in the polls.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Burgan, do you want to ask the question yourself? You had a longish one in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Tom. It's a great session. And I think this is really noble if we could do everything through the process, the deep democracy process and the consultation process that we have. But I feel like the time and resource for this process and its skills and expertise to have a facilitator who could run this process seems a bit of a wealth that that we don't have to, on the wicked problems that we're talking about. The urgency that we also push for these wicked problems is there. So could you share a bit on those, please?
Yeah, I agreed. I think I don't know if this helps, but I think that if it was a question of time and resources, and it was a sort of a pick one of these that you can use because the time for that other type of consultation, I would lean into the critical systems heuristics, because you can answer those questions quite quickly if you have to. You can say, well, we're going to use, the world climate. We're going to use, this is the data we're going to use. This is the worldview that's using. This is this client. I think that in the sense of the time crush and the time pressure, I would at least try and hold on to the critical systems heuristics, because those questions, you can take a long time with them, take a short time with them, but at the very least, they are going to make you be reflective about the boundaries you're choosing and be able to speak with clarity to those affected about the boundaries and about the epistemology at work. So my hope is that, this is, sort of devoting my life to on this mission is, this goes to work we do at Conflict Theater. We're on an unfinishable quest, which is to raise the competency of people to be in disagreement, to raise the capacity of people to engage in conflict. So we need those short-term mechanisms, as you're saying, that when time and pressure is so on, but hopefully at the same time we can be raising the level of ability to think that way, which is why I'm always on a crusade to try and embed systems thinking and other types of dialogic processes across post-secondary education. I think we should be learning systems thinking starting in elementary school. I'm biased that way because that's my community. But I think these types of deliberative processes need to start very, very young, so that they just become part of the air we breathe. It may be that's a quixotic or utopian kind of dream, but that's my hope. And in the short term, I would say the critical systems heuristics is the one I would hold on to.
The science denier question has sort of inspired a couple of follow-ups. Patrick, not Tom, do you want to speak to that or ask? Oh, I see you're chewing. I'm sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot. Totally legitimate.
It's okay. I can chew and talk as long as that's okay. No, I think that's okay. I posed another question, and maybe I'm out of order, but Tom, you've mentioned the boundaries. What I found in a lot of organizations or teams that I've collaborated with or been a part of as a team is an inability to actually see what those boundaries are. So would that be part of a facilitative process that you engage others in?
Yeah.
Because there's one thing saying, let's work within these boundaries. Let's work within the biases that we each have. But there's another thing saying, are you aware of the biases that you have? And so
Yeah.
so I guess that's my question to you. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the notion of a boundary is step one. I mean, I think that's why this to me is as much where, you know, Ulrich says he's drawing on philosophy as much as he is drawing on anything else. The epistemological, the sort of ontological and epistemological assumptions and frameworks are invisible to us most of the time. I think that one of the reasons there's an assumption of boundaries and why they seem to be leaping all over the place, why when we're in a meeting and we're arguing, Patrick and I are in some of the same meetings where these things happen, is like,
we never argue.
What are we talking about? Literally, it comes down to what are we talking about? Are we talking about the classroom? Are we talking about our department? Are we talking about that program? Are we, the fact that we don't even think in terms of boundaries is the first step to try and address, right? To realize that when we talk about a thing, we start by drawing a distinction around that thing. And this philosophically goes back to, there's a great book by a guy named George Spencer Brown called Laws of Form, where he says that the first human act of cognition is to make a distinction. The opening sentence is a demand. Draw a distinction! Exclamation point is the first sentence of this book. How do we cognize individual entities? We say, here's a thing, this is the computer, and everything else in my room is not a computer, and this is the desk, and this is not the desk. So yeah, we kind of have to go back to kind of epistemological questions and ontological questions to even surface the idea that we're using boundaries all the time. They're baked into the way we think and act, but we're not reflective upon them. So yes, that it starts with just acquainting ourselves to what those are. Yeah.
Thank you.
Shelley, who's also an enthusiast for systems learning, is talking about difficult questions to science deniers. Shelley, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are the difficult questions you want to ask Tom on that? Let's see if he's going to stay comfortable.
So I don't really have a question. I can share from my experience. So my partner was against vaccination, and I'm a public health professional. Mm-hmm. So we had to have this difficult conversation, and we started early. And he kept going like, no, the system tries to control us. I don't know what's in there, blah, blah, blah. And I started by asking him, so what do you propose we do? We have this virus. Mm-hmm. We agree on this virus being a threat to us. So what would you like to do, and how would you like to go about it? And over a course of a couple of months, I would say, we kind of argued basically, and we each had our own thoughts. And I came from a public health perspective, he came from a non-medical perspective, and just we kind of worked through it until eventually he got the vaccine. So
oh, all right.
So yeah, we both did. So it was just like a process that needs to happen. But I agree, it takes time, and we need to allow that time to happen for that process to kind of sink in. Ask the difficult questions, throw them out there, and have people start thinking about it in their own world.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, I wasn't party to those conversations. First of all, I'll lay my own bias on the table and say, congratulations that you and your partner both ended up getting vaccinated. That's fun. What a wonderful ending to that story. But I think that, I think that I'm hoping that, or I'm guessing that perhaps the space in which he was able to air those concerns and not be simply labeled, a wacko or a conspiracy theorist or whatever, just that space does a lot of the work, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, who doesn't, I think, to believe that governments don't do nefarious things, even democratic ones like our own, behind our backs, is as naive as saying we should never get vaccinated. You know what I mean?
So, and I think,
history is told that governments do nefarious things. So,
and I think, so my first reaction actually was like, how come you don't listen to me? I'm a public health professional. This is my training.
Yeah.
Exactly. exactly. And he was like, well, I don't have to listen to you. I have my own opinions and rights and whatever.
Yeah.
And then I just basically yeah. And I was open to if he would have decided not to get vaccinated, I would have been fine with that. And I communicated that to him. I was like, it's your body, you decide what you want to do with it. And I think that kind of allowed him to actually think about it and okay, I have control over myself. I'll decide what I'm going to do. So that's just my little experience about that.
Right. And so in a sense, you've established a different kind of boundary, so to speak, but you've said, and his agency was maintained because ideally we'll have herd immunity and you'll be safe. And my sister-in-law is hedging about the vaccine too. And we're having similar conversations
and stuff like that. People, it's so complex. It's not just get the vaccine or don't get the vaccine. It's all these other, it's a complex problem.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for sharing that.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
Tom, one of the things that Shelley said is it takes time, right? And that was what Bugan's question was sort of poking at as well, right? Is this a particularly resource intensive approach to disagreement, or are all of them, or do we have a choice when it comes to wicked problems which aren't going to resolve cheaply in time or other resources anyway?
That's great. That's a great question. I think that we do have to take the time. It is resource intensive given that time is money in our hyper driven, society. And where opening ourselves up to other ways of knowing and other ways of thinking, even about time, would be helpful. Because if we keep just running from one pole to another and taking short-term solutions or jumping into things that, things always have unintended consequences. You can't avoid unintended consequences because the complexity is so great. But I think, again, it may sound utopian or unrealistic, but I think wicked problems just do require that time, or we're just going to keep learning the same hard lessons over and over again until, in terms of the climate, we run out of time. The Earth will continue without us. The biosphere will continue to exist. And so either we'll adapt ourselves to it or we won't. But yes, it does require time. And I think that leads to other deeper questions that our Western in quotes, technical rational society needs to ask itself about time and the ways we value time. And how that sense of time is connected to the paradigm of constant growth and unlimited growth.
Next question I see is, can you facilitate if you have strong opinion on one side? Not just the science deniers, right? But more broadly, maybe this is a sort of a polarization question in part. And is it enough then to voice the bias to start out with, or are there other things necessary?
Well, it is possible, but it's not easy. And maybe, only individuals can know whether they can do it. For me, because I decide as the facilitator whether or not I'm going to also be involved in voicing the arguments, and the facilitator can do that if they want to. I think what helps me is that I'm kind of a radical constructivist to begin with, because I believe in the deep limits of my own knowledge, even just based on by radical constructivism, I mean based even in just the biological limitations of what my consciousness can know. I feel that I can, as long as I've got the opportunity to voice it, I can surrender to the process of the arrows being fired on both sides. But I'm sure not everyone would feel that they could do that. But there's, I find that the greatest thing is that as we go along, your brain starts firing up with all the counter arguments. But when you go, I'm going to get time. We're going to do this until we're done. That it becomes easier to relax and listen. And that certainly helps me as a facilitator.
There's a follow-up to that, which is, so how do we prod, right? How do we get deeply entrenched hierarchical systems to begin to adopt methods like this, even begin to adopt some of these methods?
Yeah. Well, I guess I wonder, what, and folks in this group will have a lot more to tell me about this in terms of what motivates political change at the top in most instances. I mean, what convinces those who hold power that that they have to listen, right? Is it the size of a Me Too movement? Is it, the current EDI movements in the wake of the murder of George Floyd? That somehow the connection has to be made that they're again interdependencies, that their dependency on the survival of what it is they're trying to maintain is ultimately intrinsically linked to the need to be collaborative. Unfortunately, that sometimes only comes at the end of violence, on the other side of violence. Yeah, again, obviously not an easy answer to that one, but I think that we're talking about the minority government, right? When the political calculus that's going on about when am I in a position where I have to listen, and when am I in a position where I don't have to listen? I think activism, and the personal commitments that people make seem to be the main engine of creating political change when it becomes impossible to ignore those voices. And then those of us who have a certain level of privilege and power do our job in amplifying those voices when we can.
Tom, there's a couple of long posts in the chat. Do you want to take a moment to read through them and see if there's something you want to respond particularly to? Thank you, everyone.
So there's a wonder if rich countries benefit more through this process and poor countries end up losing. That's a great question. I mean, ideally, certainly using the critical systems heuristics will make, well, so if it's a question, so this comes up a lot because, of course, in Tam's class, we're dealing with international development, which even the idea of international development, of course, is fraught, right? There are those who, and it's come up in our classes, who say that any form of international development is doomed to only repeat colonializing processes. And then we've had students who basically had to take our class for a certain reason, said, I don't even know why I'm here, because I don't believe in international development at all. So we try to use the critical systems heuristics to try and tease out the implications of that, including the implications of not being involved in situations where, say, there is mass starvation or there is deep problems with the spread of disease, but I'm hopefully the critical systems heuristics create a sense of accountability through having to be accountable, clear and accountable to the people on the ground, the stakeholders. And so we have part of in our course. So in the class, we work with a development agency in India named Selco that Tam has known for a long time and can tell you a lot more about. But we get our students to take the Selco folks through the critical systems heuristics and try and ask them to answer those questions, so that even within the development group, who on some level, of course, it's easy to say, well, we're supposed to be the good guys, right? They are also being asked to answer these questions, to unpack their assumptions, to lay them on the table. That, of course, doesn't dilute ultimately power, right? So I recognize that these processes are limited by power and how firmly or strongly power is willing to flex its muscles or not. But hopefully, and why it's important, and why Ulrich also is trying to get critical systems heuristics in the hands of not just the empowered decision makers, but in people that are subject to the decision making of other people, so that they can bring those questions to the table. He's wanting to share the emancipatory nature of that thinking with the largest population possible, in the hopes in some way that can dilute some of the automatic power and some of the automatic sort of get out of jail free card of being able to say, I'm the expert. So yes, I mean, can this method break us out of the place where rich countries are going to benefit more than poor countries on its own? Probably not, but hopefully it provides some foothold or some way to try and create more transparency and more accountability.
Mm-hmm. I'd encourage everyone else to read a bit more in the chat. There's a couple of interesting threads going on there. There's another question there towards the bottom, Tom. Can you talk a little bit more about wicked problems which only appear to be a problem to some and not to others?
Right. Yes, Bulgan saying, in theory, not untrue, implied terms, not so optimistic. I understand completely and completely accept your position on that. Absolutely. I think most wicked problems that surface in a big way, most people agree that there is a problem, but they're not sure. They don't agree on what the problem is. So one that's a classic example is sort of homelessness. So one person says, well, we have a shortage of housing. And then someone says, okay, well, we build the housing, but then they have to pay for the housing. We have a shortage of jobs for those people. And then someone says, well, okay, we have jobs, but they don't have the education to do those jobs. So it's an education problem. And so it tends to be more that everyone's grasping, to use the old proverb, touching different parts of the elephant and become convinced that they know the absolute problem definition and then the absolute solution definition. So the problem definition is the lower quadrant of one of the polarities potentially, and the absolute solution definition is the upper. And so we're chasing in that way. So I think of wicked problems more. I guess part of the wickedness maybe is that some people don't see them at all, i.e., climate change or poverty. I mean, there are people who don't see them at all. So I would say that. I guess then if I start again use other systems tools, so this would then take us into using a lot of other systems tools. So I would maybe use causal loop diagrams or stock and flow diagrams from systems thinking to try and map the problem space, and the denial or indifference of segments of the population become one of the factors that end up being mapped inside the system and are accounted for as a factor inside the problem space of the wicked problem. And then maybe that indifference or lack of knowledge about those things becomes one of the places, one of the leverage, and we haven't even talked about leverage points, one of the leverage points that could be leaned into in the wicked problem. So that lack of acknowledgement of the problem, in a sense, gets folded into what the problem actually is in its increasing wickedness. I hope that was helpful.
And we've also seen some questions about different approaches to negotiations and the like in the chat. We're nearing the end of our time. Tom, are directors, film or theater systems thinkers? Is that process one that is akin to what you've described here today? And are actors wicked problems that you have to solve?
Actors are problems and they're wicked, but no, I shouldn't perpetuate those stereotypes. Actors are wonderful people, the good ones. I would say good theater and filmmakers are systems thinking, and I think that it's one of the reasons why it's no accident that I sort of drifted into this world as I started to see. There's an amazing chapter in a book called Doing Systems Research. And there's a chapter about the competencies of a systems thinker. And when I look at them, and this is one of the many papers I'm planning to write at some point, when I look at the list of the competencies of a systems thinker, to me, you could use the exact list for a good director. They're able to tolerate ambiguity is a big one. They're able to tolerate living in a state of ambiguity. They're sensitive to weak feedback when it's, they can suss out that something is not working even when the feedback is weak and not really strong feedback. So yes, I think that the good ones are already doing it. And part of what I want to do is I want to keep in this being an interdisciplinarian and shuttling back and forth between the two and bringing knowledge from the theater into systems modeling and bringing knowledge from systemic thinking into acting and directing. So that's kind of my mission, sort of going between that polarity, I suppose.
Excellent. Well, as you've seen in the chat, a number of people have also already expressed their gratitude. This has been terrific. As I was listening during the presentation, Tom, you know that slider in Zoom that makes the picture bigger or the presentation. So I made the presentation very small. I really enjoyed having you on the screen and enjoyed the energy and the presentation and listening, obviously, as the discussion also shows, listening to the content very much as well. So thank you so much today. Thank you also for your various commitments to ORIS and these activities, and doing that very much in an interdisciplinary spirit and I think a spirit of collaboration across campus that makes this a strong place to be working at and enjoyable to be working here as well. Dear audience, thank you for showing up in droves. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And please, I'm easy to find, tom.scholte@ubc.ca, just like the rest of you. It's a simple UBC handle. I would love to talk to more folks from SPPGA. I'm so interested in collaborating with folks on this side of the street, so to speak. So please, if you want to talk more, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Fantastic. Audience, thank you for showing up in such big numbers. We have been recording. This will be posted and shared through various channels. And I know this has been interesting and you're interested, so keep an eye out for other ORIS events that may also pique your interest. Have a great Friday and everyone stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.